Hello and welcome to the first chapter. There's some really important information in this chapter, so please do watch the whole of this video without skipping, because missing something in this chapter could end up costing you a lot of money. Also, Windows users will need some additional software, so at the end of this chapter, we'll look at that. Pretty much all of the course will be targeted at a live cloud deployment platform. I've decided to go for Amazon Web Services, AWS, for the course. Now, the concept would probably apply to other cloud providers as well, such as Azure from Microsoft and Cloud Foundry from Pivotal. I know that some of you will be disappointed with my choice, but I do have good reasons for using AWS. It supports all of the features that we need for our architecture. It's really well integrated with Ansible. At Virtual Pair Programmers, we have a course on the basic features of AWS. And most importantly of all, it's the platform that I use professionally. And because this course is really a bit more than a course, it's more of a worked example of how a senior architect might work, the decisions they make and how they apply them. Therefore, I have to use the cloud provider that I'm familiar with and that I use in my day-to-day work. But at the time of recording, at least, AWS is the number one, probably dominant platform, so I hope there won't be too many of you out there who are disappointed. If you're an expert on another cloud platform and you would like to re-record this course for us, then do get in touch. We would love to hear from you. Okay, well, I have to get a bit serious now. This is a tough course and we will be working in a very live environment. So therefore, I expect that you already have a good knowledge of AWS already. And you're looking for at least to the standard that we cover in our cloud deployment with AWS training course. If you're not familiar or comfortable with AWS, then get yourself right over to that course now, because you will get into trouble otherwise. Importantly on that course, there is a chapter at the end talking about cleanup. And as the warning states here, if you don't do this, you will be charged by Amazon every single month. And that's really been bothering me throughout these recordings because although on the basic course here, we didn't really use many resources, on this course you will. And I would hate to think of you having ongoing costs. Now, the costs that you incur for recording this course should be relatively minimal. But that is going to depend on you doing the right things. I can tell you that in recording this section of the course, this is the Ansible section of the course, my bill has been $3.74. Now, I think my bill is quite high, and that's because I've had to do a lot of fiddling around, re-recording, making mistakes, and so on. So I would actually expect your costs to be less as long as you are careful. Now, as on the cloud course, I do worry that some of you might get bored halfway through the course. There's no accounting for taste. And you might just abandon things. And if you do that and you leave your AWS work still running, then you'll be getting bills every month for what you've left behind. You might not even notice those bills and they could rack up. So even before we do any work in this chapter, I'm going to remind you of the steps that you need to be following at the end of every session that you do for this course. So let's say you've done 2 or 3 chapters as part of a session and you've had enough for the day and you're going home. Then you definitely would want to go to your running instances page. You're going to see in the next chapter that we're going to create an instance called Ansible Control. Now, of all of the servers that we create on this course, this is the only server that we cannot create automatically. We can't build it from scratch. Therefore, I recommend for this server, when you've finished with it, we'll just go to instance state and stop. And by stopping it, you can always restart it at a later date, and you will have got all of the configuration that we've done on the Ansible controller. We'll also be starting a lot of other servers which are temporary throwaway servers. For this first part of the course, those temporary throwaways will be called the Jenkins server. Now, you definitely don't want to have a lot of these running, especially as we'll be using quite big instance types for these. So for these servers, you definitely want to be terminating them. So I assume you know that already from your previous work on AWS, but I do need to remind you. At Virtual Pair Programmers, we can't be responsible if you forget to do this. Now, the other thing is, for a stopped instance, if I go to the volumes link here under Elastic Block Store, it will need to retain what is effectively a hard drive for that instance. And you will incur costs for that hard drive. Now, those costs are not big. We're talking a matter of cents per month. But if you decide to terminate the course and you don't want to go any further and you don't want any further costs, then you would, in that case, want to terminate your Ansible control. Now, I think on that volumes page, there were 2 drives showing there because the instances were still terminating. But you can see now, I've got 1 EBS volume left behind, and that will stay there and will cost me money as long as that instance is stopped. So do be aware of that. A little later on in the course, we will be creating some elastic IPs, we'll be creating some load balancers, and we'll be creating some auto-scaling groups. They would also need to be terminated as well. However, I will repeat that when we get to that part of the course. Now, what I've done with my AWS account is I've actually borrowed an account from one of my colleagues. And the reason I've done that is their account was completely clean. They haven't created anything in here in the past. So I've done that in the hope that my environment should match yours. However, one of the problems with working with AWS is AWS do change things over time. And sometimes the defaults are different on different accounts. So please, if you have any problems with your AWS infrastructure, I don't want you to struggle and give up on the course. I'd rather that you send us a contact and we can look at that and we can work out if there's a fault with the course. So do contact us if you run into any kind of bother. Now, the other thing that I want to warn you about is something that I have fallen foul of myself when doing these recordings. In the next chapter, you're going to be creating an instance called Ansible Control. And it turns out that this instance is the only instance that we can't create automatically from a script. There will be some manual steps to follow in making that server. Apart from that one, we're going to be starting and stopping and certainly terminating a lot of instances here. And at the time of this recording, the user interface here is really bad. And we will use the user interface a little bit, even though our general aim is to do everything through scripts. I do think that for a video, the manual steps are better done. There will be a few manual steps, and they're done better using the UI. And the problem I found with the UI is, let me just demonstrate this. Let's say we decide we've come to the end of a session, say, and there is an odd quirk of the user interface, which means it's quite easy to accidentally terminate instances when you didn't mean to. I think to demonstrate, I'll take this Ansible controller and I'm going to stop it. And remember, for the duration of you doing this course, you want to keep this Ansible controller available. So you won't terminate it, you will just stop it. And while it's stopping, let's say we decide to go ahead and terminate these 2 other instances. So I select these 2 instances, and I don't know if you can tell this on the video, it may be my monitor. It's not obvious to me that I still have the Ansible controller line selected. And that's because they've put this silly animation on here to tell you that the Ansible controller is changing state. And it's not obvious that that line is selected still. So if I now go to Actions, Instance State, and Terminate, and I'm not thinking, I might not notice that I've accidentally added the Ansible controller to the list of instances that I want to terminate. And it's not a complete disaster if that happens, because the steps involved in creating the Ansible controller are not that complicated. There's just a few actions you would need to perform. For that reason, I've given you a PDF guide in the Practicals and Code folder, which runs through the steps you need to follow to rebuild that Ansible control node if for any reason you terminate it. I just wanted you to be aware of that, just in case you fall foul of it. But generally, while you're doing the course, you want to keep the Ansible controller either running or stopped. One little trick I've discovered, and I really can't on my monitor see, I think this line is highlighted in blue, but it's not very clear to me. But what I often do is I click the All button here to select everything, and then click it again, and then I know I've deselected everything. Then I can go ahead and safely terminate the instances I want to terminate. So I hope that's all okay. I would hate for you to have to incur any unnecessary costs. I would expect that the total bill for AWS for doing this entire course should be less than, say, $10. Okay, now we're going to be doing a lot of work on the command line. We are going to need to use a Unix or Linux flavored command line. So if you're already on Linux or Unix, or if you're using a Mac, then you can now safely proceed to the next chapter. If you're on Windows, you will need a decent terminal emulator. You may have one already, in which case, again, you can proceed to the next chapter. It needs to support, at the very least, SSH and SFTP, and it also needs to support Git. If you don't have one of those, then the one I would recommend is called cygwin, which you can find from cygwin.com. You can download that from the install cygwin link. You'll need to choose whether you're 32 or 64-bit Windows. And I wouldn't normally bother showing you the install steps, but this is just a little bit awkward. You've got to be careful when you go through this wizard. There's quite a few steps to follow. Choose one of the mirrors. You've got to make sure on this select packages list that you have the full set of packages that you're going to need for this course. And to be honest, I can't remember what the defaults are, so I just want you to double check that you're getting the right things. On this drop down here, make sure that's set to full. And on the search box, put in a search for SSH. Now, I'm fairly sure that this will be installed as standard, but what you're looking for is the line that says Open SSH. And you want to make sure that the option here in this column is not set to skip. And skip means it won't be installed. If it does say skip for any reason, then click on it and it should start showing a version number. For the later sections of the course, we will also need Git. And I'll talk about that when we get there. There's a lot of other related libraries, but the one you're looking for is just simply called Git, the distributed version control system. Again, we don't want to see a skip on there. Click on that and you should see a version number. And then just complete the wizard. Okay, that will drop a shortcut onto your desktop, or you can access it by using the Run dialog box and just type in cygwin. So the last thing I want to say about cygwin, again, this is only relevant if you've never used it before. There is a slight mismatch between the directories you can see here and the directories you see on your Windows machine. If I do a pwd to print my working directory, you can see that I'm seeing a Unix-style directory listing here. I appear to be under a folder called /home/work. Now, of course, that doesn't match the structure of a PC hard drive. But what you're actually seeing here is if you go to your C drive, there will now be a full folder called cygwin. And under there will be a full folder called home. And then there will be a folder for your particular username. And in fact, the contents of this folder are the contents of the /home/work folder. Now, I've created a folder in here called Microservice_course. And I've decided that that's where I'm going to do all of my work for this course. And I find that quite convenient. However, if you want to work elsewhere on your hard drive, then the way that cygwin works is there is a mount point called /cygdrive. If you CD into that, then you will find a folder representing each of your hard drives. So if I change directory, for example, onto C, then I'm seeing here the entire contents of my C drive. So if you're working in a traditional Windows folder, then you can always get to it through that. But I think that's all you really need to know for cygwin. So if you're new to it, you should find it quite easy to work with. So that's the background for the course. It's time now to move on to the first major section of the course, where we're going to be looking at a wonderful configuration management tool called Ansible. So I'll see you for that.